Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and for the next couple of weeks we'll be talking about the Achilles Crusades.
Now, the Achilles Crusade is a fairly new crusade from the Imperium of Man, yet it has been an important key to the Dominus era. Now, the crusade started before the Great Rift and the rebirth of Rabute Gilman, but if it is ever completed, the Imperium might be saved by this single crusade. But wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start back at the beginning, shall we? Now, the catalyst for the launching of the Achilles Crusade was the unexpected discovery of an active warp gate in the turbulent marges of the Halo stars, close to the border of the Calexis sector in the Segmentum Obscurus. This ancient and vastly cyclopean alien device of unknown age proved to be both active and stable, with a corresponding gate aperture into real space on the other side of the galactic core at the edge of the Jericho Reach. Though the Jericho Reach had at one time been under Imperium control, the existence of this gate within its boundaries had never been discovered, a further mystery that has never been solved. The warp gate and the possibilities it offered only came to light in 755.M41, when the navigator of the Imperial flag freighter Spear of Tarsus sensed something causing a localized area of calm in the great warp storm bordering through which she was steering passage. Dropping out of the warp, close to the source of this tranquil sea, the frigate found itself in the presence of a vast warp gate of Xenos design, placed in the cold blackness of interstellar space, far from the orbit of any star. A gate that, though undoubtedly ancient, had been activated, or reactivated at any rate, in the recent past. With this discovery, a chain of events were set in motion that would cause the Achilles Crusade to be launched across the stars. Once the Spear of Tarsus had returned to Imperial space, bearing news of its discovery, it was not long until a secret expedition was launched to discover the nature of the gate and where it led. Ships serving the Adeptus Mechanicus Explorators and the Ordo Xenos sent scouting ships through, crewed with the most able agents and experienced navigators. Their swift return not only told of another gate, also hanging in the empty void far from any star, but also of the certain truth that this other gate lay in the eastern fringe of the Segmentum Ultima, near the Jericho Reach all the way on the other side of the galaxy. With this realization, a plan was born within the minds of the great lords of the Imperium. The possibility of using the gate to launch a crusade into the Jericho Reach and reclaim it for the Imperium as a stepping stone to other conquests. The idea found favor with the High Lords of Terra, who gave it their blessing, and so the idea of a most singular crusade grew in possibility in the minds of the great, until they decided to give the title of Lord Militant to one man, and one man alone, Tiber Achilles. And so he was given mandate to make it a reality. Now, who is this man who the High Lords of Terra would deem worthy enough to have single control over so many servants of humanity? Well, let me give you the details. The story of Tiber Achilles began thousands of light years from the Jericho Reach, and many years before the Imperium's discovery of the warp gate that connected the Calexis sector to the Reach. Born in the Exoniad sector on the hive world of Lodrium, Achilles was a product of a long and noble line of generals and commanders which had served the Exoniad sector's lords for centuries. The lexicographers of Lodrium, however, recorded his birth year as laced with prophecy and portent. It was written that on the day of his birth, there was an unanticipated convergence of Lodrium's 7 moons, and a rolling eclipse that lasted for almost a solar week over the hive city in which he lived. Other signs included sightings of strange visitors to the hive, thin, graceful men dressed in robes who never showed their faces and vanished when approached. Strange ships were spotted in orbit, appearing only on the edge of sensor sweeps and disappearing before their existence could be confirmed. These peculiar events, however, were not associated with the then infant Achilles, as despite his high birth he was but one of a dozen sons of the Achilles line and merely another spire brat in the eyes of the nobles of Lodrium. Yet, as he grew to adulthood, Tiber Achilles began to distinguish himself from his brothers and sisters and live up to the grand legacy of his name. A masterful swordsman and canny tactician, he excelled in the ranks of the Lordrium officer cadre as a cadet, earning a bloody reputation as a duelist even before his second naming day. While his siblings largely succumbed to the vices of nobility and the decadence of their highborn lifestyle, Tiber became even more driven to succeed with each passing year, as if he knew somehow there was a task for which he had been born and which only he could complete. His first taste of combat came during the Redgarvi Ashlander riots on Lordrium, as a 20-year-old officer of the 38th High Corlo Planetary Defense Force Regiment. As in his previous endeavors, he made a name for himself quickly, securing the Hive's central lifters in a series of bloody battles and brutal holding actions against the Redgarvi hordes. For his courage and his skills, he was awarded both the Lordrium Silver Shield and a place in the sector's lord's own personal regiment, the Exoniad Purebloods. It was over the next 40 Terran years and the service of the Purebloods that Tiber Achilles would earn sector-wide reputation, even becoming a known commander in the nearby Scarius and Calexis sectors for his role in the Fringe campaign. These were the years in which he faced the bloodthirsty Crave, the Sons of the Bleeding Shadow, and the Ilarian Collective in the depths of the Halo Stars and on the edge of the Exoniad sector. A rising star of the Astra Militarum and a stalwart ally of the Imperial Navy, Achilles traveled extensively and made many contacts with the noble houses and prominent imperial organizations of the region. It was said by those that met the man that he had an air about him, a natural charisma or presence that seemed to call out to those around him and put them at ease. Such was the strange effect he had on both allies and enemies, that in the many years he served in the Purebloods, not one of his peers had anything bad to say about him, nor did he seem to make any political foes at all. This feat in itself is quite remarkable amongst the imperial military structure, and practically unknown. Period. It was during this period of ascension that one of the more unusual incidents surrounding Achilles occurred. It was while he was campaigning on the Formurian sector against the Krav and their allies, cleansing the cursed Sidrati 7 systems. After defeating the Krav vanguard fleet around the world of Taro, he made planetfall with a battalion of purebloods to clear out any Xenos which had escaped the fighting and landed on the world. An uncharted planet, Taro was a labyrinth of frozen canyons and ice tunnels which forced Achilles to divide his landing party into platoons to find the surviving Xenos. After hours of searching, Achilles and the men with him became lost, stumbling into an ancient ruin of strange but familiar architecture. Almost immediately, Eldari Pathfinders attacked them, and their platoon was cut down in a matter of minutes, leaving only Achilles and a few of his troops alive. A secret report from one of these survivors, gathered years later by the Ordo Xenos, recounts what happened next. Apparently, even as the leader of the Pathfinders loomed over the wounded Achilles to finish him, she seemed to pause, looking closer at the general before turning to her warriors and motioning for them to retreat. Why this occurred was never documented, and Achilles never spoke of it. However, the eyewitness swore that when the alien looked at Achilles, it seemed to recognize him. A strange anecdote of Tiberius' history. Yet, let us continue. To lead an imperial crusade, a commander must have more than just experience, charisma, and favor. In such an undertaking, it is not enough for a man to be the greatest in his field, or the most idolized among his peers. He must have something more. When the warp gate to the Jericho Reach was discovered, and the first whispers of crusade began to permeate among the upper echelons of the Imperium, Achilles found himself drawn to the cause. Struck by the righteousness of conquering the Jericho Reach and bringing its worlds back into the light of the God Emperor. It was as if this was a moment of greatness Achilles had been waiting for. And typical of his confidence and drive, he wasted no time in rallying support and gathering together allies to make his dream a reality. Here, history turns up yet more anomalies and curiosities, as even though Achilles was a man of power and influence, Even he should have had a long struggle to win the hearts and minds of 3 sectors, as well as the favor of the High Lords of Terra, to mandate his claim to lead the crusade. Typically, such a political viper's nest could take Terran years to resolve as families and military commanders circled and skirmished to gain the power to make a petition to the High Lords. In the case of Tiber Achilles, it only took solar months. Rivals changed their allegiance when they learnt of his intent, while stubborn holdouts came around to his way of thinking. At the time, it was seen as the great charisma and connections Achilles must have had, and seemed to speak of his ability to hold together the many factions which would make up a crusade and thus favor him for the job. A closer look, however, revealed more than just the persuasive tongue of a much-loved commander, but in some cases, complete shifts in stance or personality for particular opponents. Even a brief spat of assassinations, typical of many significant ascensions within the Imperium, seemed as much for show as to aid Tiber Achilles. For better or for worse, however, in those first months following the formation of the Crusade, Tiber Achilles was named Lord Militant, and the Crusade had begun. However, Tiber Achilles was only to lead the Crusade for 9 short standard years, and oversee just the very beginning of its push into the Reach. In that time, he proved an able commander, and a strong presence for the Imperial forces, holding together the at times fragmented organizations and officers under his control. The High Lords were mindful, however, that the existence of the Gate and what it portended offered a dire peril as well as possibility, and decreed that the crusade was to be launched from the staging point far from the territory it intended to conquer under a shroud of the deepest secrecy. But, like so many other great campaigns launched in the millennia that the Imperium has stood, it was intended to bring swift victory, and to use the light of the God Emperor to drive back the darkness. On the eve of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 777.M41, countless millions of Astra Militarum, thousands of Adepta Sororitas, and as many as a dozen Space Marine chapters advanced to conquer the worlds of the Jericho Reach, in the shadow of battle titans, and to the thunder of guns of the Imperial Navy. It was a bold and fiery beginning. Acting on the best intelligence he possessed, unfortunately, Achilles badly underestimated just how entrenched or dangerous native resistance to the Crusade was as a whole. Yet his core belief was that the Crusade had been launched primarily to open a new front against the alien Tau, and laid his plans to this long-term goal, perhaps at the detriment of the Crusade as a whole. Yet he did do his due diligence, and Achilles spent much of his waking hours with his tacticians poring over the data gathered by the exploratory fleets and advanced scouts. The large region beyond the Gate, dubbed the Well of Night, due to its lack of worlds or stars, worried him, and he set upon making his first priority finding a suitable world on the edge of the well in which to set up a permanent Imperial presence within the Reach. Studying the charts of the region around the Warp Gate, Achilles settled on a number of possible life-sustaining worlds that would suit his purposes. Most prominent among them were Karlak, Calisi, Elphos, and Spite. Though Calisi and Elphos were closer to the Warp Gate than either Karlak or Spite, Achilles ended up discounting them, even though they would make excellent outposts and strong points. Yet, they were too poor in resources to support the kind of production he wanted to eventually put out. Spite was seemingly ideal. However, Imperial spies who had visited the world reported that it was tainted by Xeno sympathizers, and its weak governing council was already considering a treaty with the approaching Tau Empire. Thus, Achilles chose Karlak, a world still nominally loyal to the Imperium, which would be quickly subdued and exploited, and which, in turn, could be turned into a factory to fuel the Crusade. Another concern for Achilles was the nature of the Imperial force he would be commanding, comprising troops and commanders from nearly every arm of the Imperial war machine, and coming from scores of worlds and several sectors, sometimes with bitter rivalries. Literally, legions of diplomats and liaison officers worked ceaselessly to ensure that those commanders and units with grudges remained in different war zones. Troop ships and camps were often designated for regiments from specific sectors and systems, so that they would not mix with those they either hated or those that were too foreign to be trusted. All of this petty military and planetary rivalry, however, paled in comparison when measured against the problems Achilles faced when dealing with the Death Watch, Inquisition, and Ministorum. Loosely under his command, each of these imperial organizations had their own agendas and ideas as to the role they would play in the coming crusade. Now, for those of you who have followed our voxes, especially about the Inquisition, know this to be true. Yet Achilles dealt with these intrusive organizations as best as he could, yet each had their own agendas. To the Ministorum, whose primary was concerned with the bringing of imperial worlds back into the fold of the imperial creed, they made extensive demands on Achilles for control over strategic placement of their forces and the right to be the first to land on heathen worlds or deal with heathen governments. In the case of the Inquisition and the Death Watch, the War Master held a pivotal advantage. A secret source amongst the High Lords of Terra had given him much information about the activities of both in the region. Achilles knew full well they held secrets about the Reach, which would prove vital to the success of his campaign. The Death Watch especially, as they maintained a presence in the region and had done so for centuries. Try as he might, though, Achilles could not exert any direct power over the Death Watch's Astartes or force them to pass on their secret knowledge. Yet still with these problems in the backdrop, Achilles, in a relatively short amount of time, mustered a mighty armada of vessels and troops and embarked through the Warp Gate and into Jericho Reach on the eve of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension in 777.M41. Aboard his flagship,
The Proclamation of Wrath,
Achilles made a pronouncement to his staff officers, which was recorded by his war scribes for the official Crusade annuals.
There can be nothing so great as what we do this day, and though I may not live to see the completion of this mighty task, I can stand before the God Emperor when I die and say, I was here when it began.
Now, unknown to Achilles, his words would ring more true than he might have suspected. Like a righteous tide, the ships of the Crusade spread out from the Warp Gate and set out for the worlds of Khaleesi, Elphos, Healthguard, Pyrithus, Spite, and Karlak. This was the first phase of the Crusade, and part of Achilles' initial plan to take the worlds outlying the Warp Gate and fortify them, creating an impregnable bastion with which to launch further assaults into the sector and with which to protect the Warp Gate itself. Khaleesi and Elphos fell quickly, within the first year and without great loss to the Crusade. In fact, the greatest disaster of the Elphos campaign was when a Mars-class battlecruiser,
Spirit of Penance,
incinerated almost an entire regiment of the Terrax Guard due to an error by her captain. He was demoted for his error. Almost immediately, a second wave force moved through the Warp Gate and began a rapid fortifications of the worlds, turning what were once minor colonies into towering edifices of plasteel and ferrocrete, bristling with macro cannons and lance turrets. Healthguard and Perithas took longer, both due to distance and greater resistance by their populations. Healthguard especially posed a problem for the Crusaders, and though many of its nations and minor city-states were welcoming to the Imperium, or at least not foolish enough to oppose it, some resisted or tried to subvert the Crusaders. Achilles expressly forbade excessive planetary bombardment, as the mines were too valuable. And so it fell to the Astra Militarum to root the enemies out themselves. Though it was not known at the time, agents of the Stigmatas had infiltrated Healthguard and stirred up some of its population against the Crusade, turning mines into underground fortress temples and people into slaves of the Dark Gods. Healthguard was eventually subdued, though not before thousands of guardsmen had lost their lives, hacked to death, in the dark depths of its mines. In contrast to other setbacks, Karlak proved a perfect choice for the Crusade to create its headquarters, and the simple farmers and peasants of that green world welcomed Achilles with open arms. Almost immediately, the Lord Militant began to fortify, and in a few short Terran years, much of the world's forests and farmland had been stripped bare, replaced with hive-like minotauriums, and factories or mustering grounds for troops. Everywhere great winches top deep mines, working endlessly as they harvest the world's untapped mineral riches. In orbit, the Adeptus Mechanicus performed an incredible feat of engineering as they built a shipyard from space hulks and second-line vessels. This feat was so large that it could be seen from the planet by the naked eye, glinting in the sky. While Achilles fortified Karlak, his troops were fighting for their lives on Spite. In one of the first great treacheries of the Crusade, the people of Spite turned on the Crusaders after welcoming them into their cities under banners of treaty. In the Great Mirrored Palace, the emissaries of the Crusade were cut down in a brutal ambush, while all across the landing zones Imperial Guard regiments found themselves suddenly under attack. The rebels of Spite and their Tau masters, however, had badly underestimated the will and strength of the forces arrayed against them. The Imperial reprisals were swift and brutal. Even before the sun had set on the first day, the Death Watch, represented by less than half a dozen kill teams, had slain the entire high-ranking civilian and military command of Spite, including a number of Tau envoys. Within a solar week, the world was in the hands of the Imperium, and though civil unrest would continue for several standard years, the Crusaders could now settle in and begin to fortify. Thus, with the securing of the key worlds of Karlak, Kalisi, Elphos, Heathgard, Pyrathas, and Spite, Achilles had in the space of less than 5 years secured a foothold within the Jericho Reach. He had created a defensive line, which would become known by the Imperium and her enemies alike as the Iron Collar. Entrenched and well supplied, Tiber Achilles now turned his attentions to what he perceived as the first major threat to the Imperial dominion within the sector, the Tau. His scouts had already gathered vast amounts of data on the Tau Empire's presence within the Jericho Reach, and even before the Crusade was formed, it was believed that they would likely be the most significant and well-organized opposition any Imperial force would have to face. These initial intelligence reports, as well as what little the Death Watch were willing to pass on, seemed to paint a picture of a stable and expanding interstellar power, with control over significant numbers of both human and Xenos worlds. The Crusade's experiences with Spite and the sedition of its populace were also a factor, and certainly, for Achilles sealed in his mind the notion that these aliens were his primary adversary. It may have also been because Achilles considered Xenos the most significant of all the Imperium's foes, more insidious and cunning than the heretic or rebel, and more numerous than the demon or mortal servant of the warp. This was a special hatred, no doubt, seared into his personality after decades of fighting orcs, Crave, and Eldari raiders amongst the Halo stars and its bordering sectors. Now, real quick, my apologies. I briefly went over the combat that Achilles had with the Crave. And to you fine listeners, you probably just assume that they were a Chaos warband, or at the very least, Chaos cultists. This could be not farther from the truth. So real quick, let me go through the details of this strange Xenos race. The Crave are an old race, and count amongst the oldest threats known to humanity. While it is unknown if humanity did encounter them during the first conquest of space in the dark age of technology, what can be verified is that many human worlds and even powerful and technologically advanced pocket empires of humanity's survivors suffered under Crave during the Age of Strife. Alas, many of the records dating back to these times have been lost or destroyed, and it wasn't until the Emperor of Mankind launched his Great Crusade in the 30th millennium that humanity's knowledge of the Crave and their depredations became more common. Many times, the legions of the Legiones Astartes clashed with the Crave, or liberated worlds which the Crave preyed upon. In fact, the fear of returning or awakening Crave's splinter webs was so fierce in these days that they were one distinctive factor in the creation of the imperialist militia, the ancestors of today's planetary defense force. As one of humanity's oldest enemies, it is surprisingly difficult to learn hard facts about the Crave. Virtually nothing about their own history is known, nor if the species originated on a single homeworld, or perhaps evolved from a common Xenos gene stock, like the Mitsu conglomerate encountered on the Menetian Commonwealth and the Cyclops cluster. Their interaction with humanity have always been violent, and therefore the best way to learn anything about the Crave is to consult the annuals of the Great Crusade and the history of war of the Imperium's armies. The Ordo Xenos of the Inquisition ranks the Crave as a serious menace, both in terms of the threat of corruption and the threat of dominion, as the Crave prey and feed on humanity, conquer worlds and subjugate planetary populations through their immense psychic gifts. The Crave have been encountered all over the galaxy and do not seem to be very territorial. Once a planet's population has been consumed, the Crave seek out new prey to fall upon. However, as the encounter of the Indra Sul testifies, the Crave can consume a world over the course of several centuries, carefully monitoring and controlling their own population, so as not to overstretch their resources. This can also readily be found with other semi-nomadic void-faring species, such as the Nikasar, allied with the Tau Empire, who don't actually exterminate anybody. They're just kind of void-faring peoples. But yes, they're the pancake polar bears that we discussed when we talked about the Tau. But anyways, apart from this sort of cunning or social intelligence, little is known about the Crave society. Their nomadic lifestyle has led them to be designated most commonly as Crave Marauders. But it could well be that a secular Crave empire may exist or may have existed in the past. Furthermore, it is unknown if the Crave splinter webs thus far encountered by the Imperium share a common ancestry, or belong to the same political caste. In fact, while Crave have demonstrated a strong social cohesion, it is unknown if these fleets are governed by some sort of chieftain or alpha male, a council of influential individuals, or their psychic potential might indicate a form of Gestalt psychic collective, which governs the Tyranids. Like those Xenos, the Crave consume entire worlds before migrating to their next target, which has frequently led them to be compared to the locust of ancient Terra, or the Tyranids. In any case, Crave society seems to be devoted to the survival and strengthening of their race, as it allows for all individuals of their community to feed and grow strong, and not only an inner circle of selected individuals. The Crave have not tried to engage in any form of exchange or diplomatic relations with the Imperium mankind. The mind-eaters regarding humanity as little more than cattle, a food source to be preyed upon. The Crave are a highly advanced alien race, though, which mastered interstellar void travel in the distant past. Their fleets consist of larger and smaller vessels referred to as web ships, or nest ships, which seem to boast an impressive quantity of hibernation pods, both for the use of their own and that of their stored food. The Crave's technology is not so advanced as to shield them from the Imperium's arsenal, but they are more than capable of defending themselves. Like other species of psychically powerful individuals, the Crave's mastery of the warp is far superior to that of humanity. Although no such thing as a Crave battle psyker, like the Adeptus Astartes librarian, has thus far been encountered, the Crave use their individual power to forge their weapons, so-called warp glamours. Bladed weapons of every sort, these warp glamours use solidified warp matters as blades, making them inherently dangerous and easily capable of cleaving a fully armored space marine in two. This same technology has been known to be used in projectile weaponry akin to the Imperial bolter, where these warp shards serve as weapons ammunition. Some Crave weaponry has been classified as the most potent tools of destruction, such as the much dreaded Extinction Carbine, which was used by several war bands of Black Shields during the Horus Heresy era. The fact that humans were able to use these weapons indicates that they are not psychically fueled, although their use has been strictly forbidden by both the Mechanicum and the Golden Throne. I'm sorry, but I seem to have gotten distracted by telling you about this unusual and interesting Xenos race. But, yes. Getting back to the Crusade. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. The Lord Militant chose to make his first and most direct attacks against the Tau, pushing into the southern regions of the Reach to vanquish what he considered his primary foe. Mustering around Karlak and Spite, Achilles marshaled 4 battle groups, containing the bulk of his ships of the line and roughly half of his frontline regiments, drawn largely from the Calexian levies. In the vanguard of each battle group, Achilles placed his shock troops and several companies from the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes operating in the Reach. Achilles, Argoth, Kegaran, and Wraith were the targets of these battle groups. Achilles hoped that with the overwhelming numbers, and by striking all 4 worlds simultaneously, he would triumph over any Tau defenders or Tau sympathizers present, capturing the worlds and their systems in short order. Largely unknown to the Crusaders, however, was that the worlds they aimed to assault existed outside of the Tau military cordon, and the Velkhan Sept Fire class had already decided to pull back from the advancing Imperials. In their wake, the Tau left behind stealth teams with the dual purposes of confounding the enemy, as well as gathering data on his strengths and tactics. The assaults on Riles, Argoth, and Kegaran, which would later become collectively known as the Quarantine Worlds, were swift and decisive. On the mining worlds of Riles, only minor skirmishes marred what otherwise would have been the triumphant return of the Imperium. Within hours of the fleet darkening Riles' sky, Adeptus Astartes had taken the granite spire of Re, and placed the world's governor and his staff under their protection. There was a similar story on Argoth and Kegaran, a few rebels making feeble stands against regiments of the guardsmen, and planetary leaders quickly bowing to imperial rule. This was, of course, according to the plans of the Water Caste, who in the days before the invasion had cautioned patience in their human allies and promised that the Tau would return to take their world into the fold of the Empire. As a result, Achilles wasted little time setting up garrisons on all 3 worlds, but moved the bulk of his troops to more pressing war zones. Achilles' failure to completely pacify the quarantine worlds would come back to haunt the Crusade long after the Lord Militant's demise. For the moment, however, Riles, Argoth, and Kegaran had been taken. It seemed to the commanders that they had overestimated the strength of the Tau, so close to the Well of Night, which in turn led them blundering into an expertly timed counterattack on the world of Wraith. Wraith was the furthest of the 4 objective worlds, and the only place where the Tau chose to make a stand, largely to test the capabilities of the Crusaders. Using Auspic bafflers and echo sentries scattered along the edge of the system, the Tau Tal Shah Cadre was able to move its fleet in behind the Imperial assault forces undetected. As the Crusaders unloaded their vessels from low orbit, the Tau attacked, targeting vulnerable transport ships and strafing the drops as they fell into orbit. In the opening hours of the attack, thousands of guardsmen and millions of tons of material were lost before they even touched ground, vaporized or incinerated in their grav harnesses and cargo cradles. Only the timely intervention of strike cruisers from the Dark Suns chapter managed to stop it becoming a complete massacre, and allowed enough troops to land and overwhelm the Tau defense positions on the planet's surface. In the face of the Space Marine assault, the Tau Tal Shah Cadre pulled back towards the Black Reef. The Tau forces disengaged smoothly and abandoned the world in the space of a mere solar hours, as their commanders had always intended. This was a kind of warfare that at first baffled the Imperial Crusaders, and they could not understand how the Tau could so easily give ground or abandon whole worlds. It was, however, the Tau tactical and strategic flexibility which would make them so dangerous. Now, for those of you who listen to our Tau Voxes, this strategy is known as the Kayun, the patient hunter, being a more cautious approach than the Mont Ka. The Kayun teaches that the enemy should be lured into an exposed position before their weak points are smashed by a prepared assault. By offering some tasty bait, such as an important objective or seemingly vulnerable unit, commanders can position their units carefully before striking back with overwhelming force. It also teaches the folding retreat, giving ground when there is no battle to be won. Yet, Veteran commanders of the Imperium quickly learned that the Tau retreats were usually only preludes to counterattacks, often made once the Imperium had advanced and overextended its lines. Many commanders urged Achilles to press the Tau, and argued that if they could so easily snatch worlds from the Xenos, they should make an assault on the Tau core worlds themselves. In fact, at the time, the Tau were still reacting to the arrival of the Crusade, and their forces were scattered across the sector. Many committed to holding off the Stigmartus attacks from those worlds facing the Hadix anomaly. More about that later. Thus, a decisive and aggressive thrust through their lines might have been successful, and prevented much of the carnage which was to follow. Achilles, however, was mindful of not overextending supply lines and leaving vulnerable worlds in his wake, and so he gave the order to hold, reorganize, and fortify. While his commanders grumbled, the more hot-headed among them considered the old man far too cautious. They could not deny that so far the crusade had been incredibly successful, and it seemed that there was nothing that could halt its progress. Perhaps they were right, or maybe the stratagem of the Kion would swiftly turn into the Mont Ka, also known as the killing blow. But we will never know. Because during those first years it would be known as the time of the false dawn, a time when the true extent of the Imperium's enemies were still unknown, and the true battle for the Reach had yet to begin. While traveling to review the progress of the primary forward battle groups aboard the Grand Cruiser Proclamation of Wrath in 786.M41, disaster struck. The ship, the Proclamation of Wrath, suffered a catastrophic Geller field failure and was lost with all hands. The Lord Militant and his command staff were among those, drowned in the raw energies of the warp. His successor to the mantle of Lord Militant was a very different man. Solomon Tetrarchus was also an Austromilitarum veteran, but one with a reputation for bold strategy, charismatic leadership, and a practice of delegating many strategic decisions to the commanders beneath him. Within a Terran year of his ascension to the Lord Militancy, Tetrarchus had replaced or sidelined most of the old god generals who had served Achilles. In their stead, he brought up new officers who possessed the independent dynamism he valued. He then commanded that the Crusade forces be split into 3 army groups, committed most of the reserves his predecessor had hoarded to the front, and pressed the attack, predicting the fall of the Reach within a solar decade. It was these 3 groups that we will be discussing in the following weeks, but before we go, a brief understanding of what they will be striving for. The largest of these newly created Crusade forces would drive towards the core of the Jericho Reach and crush the native resistance, while the other 2 would move swiftly through the sparsely inhabited rimward worlds, encircling the former Imperial sector's core. The existing slow drive towards the worlds disputed by the Tau expansion would become but one barb of the trident that would drive through the corrupted flesh of the Jericho Reach, and make it once more the dominion of the Emperor of mankind. The 3 assailants were designated Canis, Acheros, and Orpheus, respectively. And regardless of the relative wisdom of his strategy, the war still continues 3 solar decades later, in the early decades of the 9th century of the 41st millennium. The Jericho Reach and the fate of the Crusade now hangs in the balance, as we will see in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have this week. Stay tuned for next week when we talk about the Orpheus Sailent, the first of the 3 Sailents. If you enjoyed this Vox, please like, follow, comment, and of course, subscribe. And if you made it this far in the Vox, a question that you can answer in the comments. Who won the duel? Lehman Russ or Lionel Johnson? Regardless, have a great day, and as always,
Until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.